Hollywood, September 1954. The Sabrina premiere was 3 days away. Paramount Pictures had organized a press junket at their studio lot, the kind of carefully choreographed publicity event where journalists asked pre-approved questions, studio publicists stood at the edges of the room with practiced smiles, and the stars said what they were supposed to say. Everybody played the game. That was how it worked. You smiled. You praised your director. You praised your co-stars. You said it was a privilege and an honor, and the most wonderful experience of your professional life. And then you went home and said what you actually thought. Humphrey Bogart had never been very good at the game. He was 54 years old, the biggest male star in Hollywood history by most measures, a two-time Academy Award nominee who had finally won 3 years earlier for The African Queen. He had been in this business for 30 years. He had earned the right, in his own estimation, to say exactly what he thought about directors, about scripts, about the people he worked with. Tact was for people who needed something from you. Bogart didn't need anything from anybody. He certainly didn't need anything from Audrey Hepburn. She was 25 years old, a year removed from her Oscar win for Roman Holiday, already being called the most luminous new talent in Hollywood. She was thin and strange-looking by the standards of the era, too narrow in the shoulders, too wide in the eyes, nothing like the voluptuous American ideal that studios had been packaging and selling for decades. But audiences had looked at her and seen something they couldn't name and couldn't stop looking at. The critics had fallen over each other trying to describe it. Billy Wilder, who had directed them both in Sabrina, had given up trying to describe it and simply said, "The camera loves her." Bogart had not loved her. Not on set, not off it, not for a single day of the 5 months they had spent filming. He had wanted Lauren Bacall in the role, his wife, a real actress, in his estimation, someone trained, experienced, unafraid, someone who could hit a mark in one take and look you in the eye while she did it. Instead, he had gotten this girl who needed 12 takes to get a line right, who spent her lunch breaks in William Holden's trailer while Bogart sat alone in his own, who had formed a private alliance with Wilder and Holden that excluded him from every private joke and every quiet conversation and every cocktail hour debrief. He had felt for the first time in his career like an outsider on his own film, and he had not handled it quietly. All of that history was in the room on the day of the press junket. The journalists knew about the tensions on set. Word traveled fast in Hollywood, faster than studios liked. They knew Bogart had called Hepburn unprofessional. They knew he had complained about her to anyone who would listen. They knew about the altercation with Holden that had required crew members to step between them. They were going to ask about it. They were journalists. That was what journalists did. The press event began at 10 in the morning in one of Paramount's large screening rooms. Bogart sat at one end of the table, Audrey sat at the other. Between them, Billy Wilder held down the center like a general trying to prevent a battle he knew was coming. William Holden had declined to attend, citing a scheduling conflict. Nobody believed the scheduling conflict. For the first 40 minutes, everything was managed. Wilder talked about the film. Audrey talked about Paris and about working with Wilder and about the Givenchy dresses, and said everything with the precise warmth of someone who had learned, very quickly, how to be charming under any circumstances. Bogart answered questions about Linus Larrabee and said the character was more interesting than he'd expected, and left it at that. Then a journalist from the Los Angeles Times, a man named Arthur Devlin, who had been covering Hollywood for 15 years and had not gotten where he was by asking soft questions, turned toward Bogart and asked, directly and without preamble, "Mr. Bogart, there have been reports that you had difficulties on the Sabrina set, that you found Miss Hepburn's working method challenging. Could you speak to that?" Wilder made a small movement, a barely perceptible tightening of his hands on the table. The publicists along the wall went still. Bogart looked at Devlin, then he looked at the camera, the television camera, positioned in the back of the room, red light burning, broadcasting live to a local station that would feed the footage to networks across the country. He said, "I'll tell you the truth. I don't think she has it. The talent, I mean. She's a nice girl. She tries hard, but she needed 20 takes to get a line right, and that tells you something about an actress. It tells you the instinct isn't there. You can teach someone to mark their spot and face the light, but you can't teach them to be an actor. That either lives in you or it doesn't. And in my professional opinion, after 50 years in this business, it doesn't quite live in her. The room went very quiet. Bogart picked up his water glass and drank. He seemed satisfied. He had said what he thought. That was what he did. At the other end of the table, Audrey Hepburn said nothing. She had heard every word. The microphones had picked up every word. Every camera in the room was trained on her face. The journalists had their pens ready, waiting for the reaction, the tears, the composure cracking, the young actress trying to hold herself together in front of the people who would write about it in the morning. They were waiting to see if she would survive the next 60 seconds. She was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her face was still. Then she turned, not to Bogart, not to the journalists, but toward the camera, the television camera, with its red light burning, the one broadcasting live to the country. And she began to sing, not loudly, quietly, the way you sing to yourself when you are trying to steady something inside you. La Vie en Rose, the Edith Piaf song that Sabrina sings in the film, standing on the balcony in Paris, transformed into someone new, becoming the woman she had always believed she could be. Audrey had recorded it for the film. She knew it by heart. She had sung it dozens of times in front of the camera, and dozens more alone in her dressing room, because that was how she worked, how she always worked, not in one perfect take, but in the quiet repetition of someone who understood that mastery was not a gift but a discipline. She sang it softly, with her eyes half closed, for perhaps 40 seconds. Then she stopped. She opened her eyes. She looked at the camera, and she said very simply, "That's the only answer I know how to give." The room stayed quiet for another moment. Then Arthur Devlin of the Los Angeles Times, who had been covering Hollywood for 15 years, put down his pen. He was not going to write about Bogart's comment. He was going to write about this. If you love Audrey Hepburn and her stories, make sure you like and subscribe. What happened in the room after Audrey sang was described by everyone present in the same terms, though they used different words. The publicists at the wall stopped being publicists for a moment and became people. Several journalists who had not planned to cry found themselves with wet eyes and no clear explanation for why. Billy Wilder, who had spent his career directing human beings through the most difficult moments of their professional lives, sat very still and said nothing and looked like a man who had just witnessed something he had not expected. Humphrey Bogart said nothing. He was not a sentimental man. He did not change his mind easily, or apologize often, or feel embarrassed about his opinions. But he sat there with his water glass in his hand and looked at the woman at the other end of the table and did not say anything else. The Sabrina premiere happened 3 days later, on September 22nd, at theaters in New York and Los Angeles simultaneously. The reviews were unanimous. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called it the most delightful comedy romance in years. Had praised Audrey Hepburn's performance specifically, calling her quality indefinable but completely undeniable. Every major publication said a version of the same thing. She was remarkable. She was luminous. She was the thing that made the film work, the reason the audience cared about Sabrina Fairchild's story, the reason they laughed and held their breath and felt for 2 hours that the world was the way it was supposed to be. The film opened at #1 at the box office. It stayed there for 2 weeks. Audrey Hepburn received her second Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. She did not win that year. Grace Kelly won for The Country Girl, but nobody who had sat in that screening room thought the nomination was anything other than correct. Bogart never made another film with Audrey Hepburn. Their paths crossed occasionally at industry events, and they were cordial, the careful cordiality of two people who have decided that a particular chapter is closed. He was diagnosed with esophageal cancer in 1956. He died in January 1957, at home, in the house he shared with Lauren Bacall and their 2 children. Billy Wilder visited him near the end. He was by all accounts at peace. He had lived the way he wanted to live and said the things he believed and made the films he cared about, and if he regretted any of it, he kept the regret private. He was Humphrey Bogart. He was constitutionally incapable of saying publicly that he had been wrong. But people who knew him in those last months said that he had changed his assessment of something. He had watched Sabrina in the theater, sitting next to Bacall in the dark, and he had watched Audrey Hepburn on that screen, really watched her, the way he hadn't been able to watch her on set, distracted by his own grievances and his own certainty about how things should go. and he had understood something that the set had not allowed him to understand. She was good. She was genuinely, unmistakably, irreducibly good. Not in the way he was good, not with that hard-edged naturalism and that lived-in authority that came from decades of craft, but in her own way, which was a different way, which was possibly a better way for the material and the moment and the audience she was making films for. She brought something to the screen that he could not name, and had not, in his honesty, understood when he was standing next to her and too angry to see clearly. A friend who visited him in the hospital, a director named Robert Parrish, who had known Bogart for 20 years, said that Bogart mentioned Sabrina once in those final weeks. Not the film, Audrey specifically. He said, "That girl can sing," in the tone of someone who is admitting something they have been holding for a long time. Parrish asked what he meant. "I mean, she has it," Bogart said. "I was wrong about that." He didn't elaborate. He changed the subject. He asked Parrish about a project Parrish was working on, and the conversation moved on, and Audrey Hepburn's name was not mentioned again. But he had said it. He had said she has it. For Bogart, that was as close to an apology as anything in his nature would allow. Audrey never knew he said it. She was in Rome at the time, filming scenes for a new project, moving forward the way she always moved forward, without looking back, without needing the validation of the person who had doubted her, without requiring anyone's permission to be exactly what she already was. She went on to make Funny Face and Love in the Afternoon and The Nun's Story and Breakfast at Tiffany's and Charade and My Fair Lady and Wait Until Dark. 5 Academy Award nominations, 1 win, a career that would last 4 decades and end not in retirement but in redirection, toward UNICEF, toward the children, toward the work she considered more important than any film she had ever made. She never needed 20 takes to get a line right. That had been, all along, a misunderstanding. She had needed 20 takes because the script kept changing, because Billy Wilder was writing the film as they shot it, delivering new pages at lunch for scenes that would film that afternoon, scenes that were different from the scenes she had rehearsed the night before. She had needed 20 takes because she was learning the lines of a script that did not yet fully exist. Any actor would have needed 20 takes under those conditions. Several actors faced with those conditions would have walked. Audrey Hepburn had stayed, had learned each new version, had found the scene inside each take, the way she always found it, not in the first try, but in the patient, disciplined, deeply private work of someone who understood that the thing worth doing rarely comes easily and never comes from the outside. She knew what she was. She had known on the morning of that press junket, when Humphrey Bogart looked at the television camera and told the country she didn't have it. She had known in the 60 seconds that followed, while the room held its breath and waited to see what she would do. She had sung, not to prove anything, not to answer him exactly, but because the only response she had ever trusted was the one that came from the place inside her that nobody could touch, not the critics, not the box office, not the most celebrated male actor in Hollywood history telling a live television audience that her talent was insufficient. She had sung La Vie en Rose, quietly and without ceremony, in a room full of journalists and cameras, and she had stopped and opened her eyes and said, "That's the only answer I know how to give." It was the right answer. It was, as Arthur Devlin would write in the Los Angeles Times the following morning, the only answer that mattered. Humphrey Bogart called Audrey Hepburn talentless on live television. What she did in the 60 seconds that followed left everyone in the room in tears, not because it was dramatic, not because it was a performance, but because it was the truest thing anyone had done in a Hollywood press room in years. It was the response of someone who had nothing to prove and knew it, who had been told she was less than she was, and simply, quietly, without anger or argument, showed them what she was instead. That's who Audrey Hepburn was. That's what she did. That's why we still tell her story 70 years later. If you love these stories about the real lives behind the greatest stars in Hollywood history, like and subscribe. The moments that matter most are the ones that happen when the cameras are rolling and nobody expects the truth. This was one of them. Because while telling this story, I realized something. What Bogart said that day wasn't just about Audrey. It was about you. It was about me. It was about everyone who's ever been told at some point in their life, "You're not good enough." And those voices are powerful. Sometimes they come from strangers, sometimes from bosses, teachers, family members. And sometimes the most painful moment is when that voice is no longer someone else's, when it starts speaking inside your own head. Audrey Hepburn was 25 years old that day. 25, a world-famous movie star, holding an Oscar in her hand. And still, the most powerful man in the room looked at her and said, "Not enough." Think about that. If even in that moment you're not enough, then when will you ever be? Audrey's answer was a song, but the real answer wasn't the song. The answer was this: I don't have to prove myself to you. I don't have to be angry at you. I don't have to argue with you. I can simply show what I am, and that's enough. Because we humans are wired to seek approval, especially the approval of the person who belittles us. We want the door that said no to us to open. We want Bogart to stand up and say, "I was wrong, you're a genius." And when that approval doesn't come, something inside us collapses. Audrey didn't wait for that approval. She sang her song and stayed silent, and that was it. What Bogart thought was no longer her problem. So I want to ask you, right now in your life, is there an area where someone has said, "You can't do this"? Is there a voice outside or inside that makes you feel small? If there is, know this: that voice doesn't always tell the truth. Most of the time, it's the voice of someone who's afraid of you, someone who doesn't understand you, or simply someone who's angry, tired, or wrong. Before he died, Bogart admitted quietly, in a room with no one listening, "I was wrong. That girl could sing. I was wrong." That confession was powerful, but what was even more powerful was this: Audrey lived without waiting for it. She chose without waiting. She grew without waiting. She became herself without waiting. Maybe that's the greatest courage of all, to take a step without waiting for approval, to exist without waiting to be understood, to move forward without waiting to be proven right. If you liked this story and want to see more on this channel, subscribe now. Every week we share stories from Audrey Hepburn's life about strength and vulnerability, about what grace really means. Not just about famous names, stories that touch you, make you think, invite you to see things differently. And I want to say this: thank you for watching this video, truly, because telling these stories only has meaning when there are people listening.